Hi everybody, and welcome to this video which goes through the factors that affect attitude formation and attitude change. This is part of the social influence topic for Stage 2 psychology. Let's get started. So in my previous video, I went through the structure of attitudes and that we have an attitude to absolutely everything, whether that be positive, negative, neutral, or ambivalent. But we also need to discuss how attitudes are formed and how they can change, and that's the purpose of this video. So attitudes are affected by external factors associated with persuasion. So persuasion is the process of changing our attitude towards something based on some kind of communication from other people. So this part of the curriculum particularly applies to advertising. So companies will try and persuade us through their ads, whether it's TV, radio, commercials, magazine commercials, billboard commercials, and so on, to buy a product or use their service or have a particular attitude or point of view. Politicians will also work in the area of persuasion to get voters to vote for them in the coming elections. So we are bombarded every single day with advertisements in many different formats to try and persuade us to form a positive attitude or a negative attitude sometimes to some things, and try and change our attitudes from a formerly negative to positive or vice versa. So this video really focuses on the main theories to do with persuasion in advertising, and all of these theories overlap each other. So we're going to explore the Yale communication approach, the elaboration likelihood model, and experience. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So the Yale communication approach are the conditions and circumstances under which people are most likely to change their attitude in response to persuasive messages. So the Yale communication model structure is made up of three parts. So the source, so where the actual advertisement is coming from, the message, what they want the intended audience to feel or what they want them to take away from the advertisement, and of course the audience, because certain ads are catered and tailored towards a particular target audience. So we're going to explore these factors now. Let's start with the source. So as part of the Yale communication approach, the source is very, very important. It is worth mentioning, if I just jump down to the second dot point, that the first source is the company or the organization that produced the advertisement. So for example, the government or the company. So in these examples over here, this top advertisement here for Sensodyne, Sensodyne would be the first source, and then the second source are the people or the actors in the actual ad itself, as I've said here. So the first source is the company, the second source is who's actually in the ad. So in this example down here, the first source would be Menulog and the second source would be Snoop Dogg. In this advertisement here, the first source would be Chanel and the second source would be Nicole Kidman. So in terms of who we use or who was actually delivering the ad, that's what the source refers to. Now, research shows that we are more often persuaded by experts in the area because they're perceived to be more trustworthy. So that's often why when we see ads for toothpaste and things like that, they will have the actor or the secondary source perceived to be a doctor or a professional in the area. So we can see that here with the addition of a white coat and so on. So that then makes it more persuasive in terms of buying Sensodyne because it's perceived that the secondary source pictured here is an expert in the area, and that's more likely to be perceived as trustworthy. We are also persuaded by attractiveness, regardless of the information provided. So that's definitely applicable to these bottom two advertisements down here. So we have a very, very attractive picture here, very pretty bottle and a very beautiful woman. And we are persuaded by the attractiveness of the overall ad. That's also the case for the Menulog ad, using bright colors and a very well-known musician who is very, very popular with a very catchy slogan, and it's very aesthetically pleasing. Often when we hear ads, especially radio and television ads, fast talkers are far more effective than slow talkers. Now, there's a few reasons for this. First of all, TV ads don't tend to go for too long, so they want to pack in as much information as they possibly can. But also, people who talk fast are perceived to know what they're talking about and are seen to be more excitable, and they're more persuasive and more effective in either changing our attitudes or forming our attitudes if the source, the secondary source, is talking quickly. Often they will talk much louder than normal as well to emphasize the importance of the message. So particularly in certain ads like used car salesman or bargain ads or secondary furniture ads, they will talk very, very loudly to you. So things like save, 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 this weekend only. So they will actually talk a lot louder than normal talking volume. And this is perceived as emphasizing the importance of the message. And it's seen it's a very effective persuasive technique. Moving on to the message now, which is the second part of the Yale communication approach. Regardless of the ad type or what it is they're actually advertising, the aim is to evoke an emotional response. Now, what emotion will obviously depend on what they are advertising or what they're trying to communicate. So this might be fear, it might be sadness for an awareness campaign, or it could be joy or happiness if they're trying to get you to buy a product. So one of the main ways they emphasize this message is through music and or sound effects to further exaggerate the emotional response in the audience. It is also worth mentioning that subliminal messaging is very limited in its effectiveness based on the research that's been conducted recently. So people need to be cognitively aware of what they're actually listening to and what they're watching. So two very good examples of the message are the infamous Australian anti-smoking advertisement pictured here. This was released in 2009, and the Carlton Draft Big advertisement. So obviously very different tones, very, very different emotions being conveyed because they're about different things. But it is both of these are very, very good examples of evoking an emotional response. So the first one being fear and concern and sometimes guilt, and the second one being humor and happiness. Now, the audience is also extremely important when considering this approach. So people aged between 18 to 25 are more susceptible to attitude change through advertisements. After this age, however, attitudes are more stable and resistant to attitude change. So what this means is that as we get older, advertisements tend to be less effective unless they are using the central root of persuasion, which I'll talk about later. But typically, younger people are more susceptible to attitude change or changing their attitudes, in other words, through advertising, and also forming their attitudes through advertising. It's also been seen that people who are less intelligent, so not as developed, are more susceptible to attitude change than highly intelligent people through just a simple advertisement. Now, speaking of the central root and the peripheral root, this relates to the elaboration likelihood model, which I'm going to talk about next, but it is applicable to the Yale communication approach as well. So if companies use the central root of persuasion, this is more effective for high-level thinkers. So typically adults who don't change their attitudes as easily, it's far more effective to use the central root, and the reasons why will become obvious later. The peripheral route is far more effective for self-conscious people. So typically younger people, again, aged between 18 to 25, who are more influenced by aesthetics. So speaking of which, let's now talk about this elaboration likelihood model, and we'll come back to the audience once we're done. So this approach considers the variables of the Yale communication approach, so the source, the message, and the audience, and then it organizes it into what ad plays a certain role. So according to the elaboration likelihood model, there are two main routes that play a role in delivering a persuasive message. So in other words, there's two ways that an ad can be organized and delivered in terms of its effectiveness. So one way is the central route and the other way is the peripheral route. So starting with the central route, this is about making the audience think carefully about the message to evaluate the information. So central route advertisements are driven by logic and uses data and facts and statistics to convince people. So the emphasis is not on the aesthetics of the ad, but the information and the message being delivered, or the argument, in other words. So this message needs to be credible, presented clearly, and substantiated, or backed up, in other words, by actual evidence. It focuses on the quality of the product or the importance, again, of the message rather than how the ad looks. Often central route advertisements focus on serious and relevant issues that are aimed at an older or adult audience. And for the central route to be effective in changing attitudes, thoughts, and beliefs, the argument must be strong, and if it's successful, it will result in lasting attitude change. Pictured here is a very good example of a central route ad. We can see that there is a lot of information on this particular slide here. So there's facts and statistics and information that substantiates the need to stop smoking, which is the focus of this particular ad. So it's not focused on how pretty or beautiful the ad is. It's more focused on the importance of the message and the argument, which is to get people to stop smoking. It's got a lot of information provided by reputable sources. So that's worth keeping in mind as well. Even though the elaboration likelihood model is a separate theory, it is heavily related to the Yale communication approach, which is what we just talked about. So we can see here the quit line is a reputable source. We've got the secondary source here, and we've got obviously the information that's around it, delivering the strong message through substantiation and fact that people should stop smoking, targeted at an older audience. Now, looking at the peripheral route of persuasion, this is very, very different. So this focuses on peripheral cues, meaning it relies on association with positive characteristics such as positive emotions, celebrity endorsement, or images of beauty and pleasure. So to put it simply, the peripheral route of persuasion very much focuses on the aesthetics or the appearance of the ad looking as appealing as possible. Generally, peripheral route of persuasion ads are aimed at younger people with low self-confidence who are easily persuaded. Children are targeted through peripheral route with bright colors, jingles, and cartoons. Now, the audience does not need the message to be strong, and the advertisements often have very low elaboration or information. Perfume commercials are an excellent example of the peripheral route of persuasion. As pictured here, we have a very beautiful actress in this case, Zendaya, and she's promoting this new fragrance here. We don't know anything about the fragrance. We don't know what it smells like. We don't know how much it costs, how many milligrams, where we can get it. The emphasis is obviously just on the beautiful appearance of the ad, and that will be enough to be persuasive. Whereas central, what we just talked about, relies on the argument or the statistics and the message. The peripheral route is the opposite. It focuses solely on the aesthetics. So if we go back a moment to the Yale communication approach, we can see here that these two bottom advertisements definitely use the peripheral route of persuasion. Again, perfume commercials are a very, very good example. So again, we've got the beautiful actress, and it's very aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Same with this ad here. So again, using bright colors, very appealing, and obviously a very popular musician with a very catchy jingle as well. Whereas this ad up here, it doesn't have too much information, but it's definitely leaning more towards the central route of persuasion because it's got more information and more statistics than these two bottom ones do. So the peripheral route is often about very unimportant issues. So things that are not vitally important, such as, perfume commercials, makeup commercials, designer handbags, things like that. Often fast food commercials will use the peripheral route of persuasion as well. So typically are about very unimportant things, whereas central route, if I just go back, are about important issues aimed at an older audience. So again, just going back to the Yale communication approach in terms of the audience, hopefully that makes a little bit more sense now. So people aged between 18 to 25, are more susceptible to peripheral route, whereas adults over the age of 25 are more susceptible to central route in terms of forming their attitudes and changing their attitudes. Now, it is worth mentioning as well that we can form and change our attitudes through having a direct or indirect experience. So it's not always about advertising necessarily. So attitudes that are formed through experiencing something yourself is going to be far more effective than simply seeing it in an ad, which is an indirect form, but I'll get to that later. So attitudes that are formed this way through a direct experience tend to be more strongly held and resistant to change because we tend to talk and think about things that have happened to us personally. Whereas we can also, of course, form our attitudes or change our attitudes indirectly. It's not necessarily through an advertisement, although that is correct as well. It may be exposed to a topic or a person that is less personal. So this is an example from your workbooks. Consider bullying in schools where a group of people develop an attitude about another group of people without any personal interaction between the groups whatsoever. So they simply hear about it from others that you're not to talk to that group because they're uncool or something like that. Now, attitudes formed indirectly or through an indirect experience tend to be more susceptible to change. They're less emotionally intense and don't evoke the same amount of thinking that a direct experience does. Another very good example of this is experiencing a roller coaster. So if someone's actually gone on a roller coaster, so they've had a direct experience, that's going to lead to a much more strongly held attitude compared to hearing about going on a roller coaster from somebody else and never actually ridden one yourself. So yes, we are influenced in terms of our attitudes by advertising and hearing it from others, but the strongest way, or the attitudes that we hold the strongest or have the biggest impact on us, are those that we actually experience directly. And that is the end of this revision video. As always, I hope you found this very useful. Any questions, let me know. Otherwise, happy revising.